I always believed the splitting headaches were the cost of my ambition, and my husband, the brilliant neurosurgeon, was my savior. But when a stranger looked into my eyes and whispered the truth, my perfect life disintegrated. The device in my head was never a cure. It was a biological lock, and the man I had shared a bed with for 5 years was just a warden patiently waiting for the day he could finally harvest me. It all started innocently enough. My name is Elena Sterling, and at 32 years old, I lived inside a gilded cage made of glass and steel perched high above the gray skyline of Seattle. To the outside world, I was a successful graphic designer who had simply chosen privacy over the bustle of city life. In reality, my existence had shrunk to the walls of this high-tech fortress, dictated by the pounding rhythm of the migraines that had plagued me for half a decade. They were not just headaches, they were seismic events that fractured my vision and left me gasping for air on the cool marble floors of our bathroom. My husband, Dr. Julian Thorne, was the only one who could bring me back from the edge. A genius neurosurgeon at the prestigious Ethelgard Brain Research Institute. Julian was the perfect partner. He was handsome, attentive, and seemingly devoted to curing my ailment. He managed everything with a clinical precision that I mistook for love. He prepared my meals, weighing the proteins and greens to ensure optimal brain health. He set the smart lighting in our bedroom to mimic natural circadian rhythms, insisting that sleep was the ultimate healer. Every Sunday evening, he would roll up the sleeve of my silk robe and administer an injection of a translucent, amber liquid. He called it a special serum, a cocktail of neurostabilizers he had developed specifically for my unique physiology. I would wince as the needle pierced my skin, but the relief that followed always felt like a miracle, albeit a temporary one. However, the air in our home often felt too thin, too controlled. This sensation was amplified whenever Julian's mother, Victoria Thorne, came to visit. Victoria was a woman carved from ice and old money, her presence lingering in a room long after she left. She rarely looked me in the eye. Instead, her gaze would drift upward, fixing intently on my forehead or the crown of my head. It was a calculating look, the way an appraiser studies a rare Ming vase or a diamond of questionable provenance, searching for hairline fractures. She made me feel less like a daughter-in-law and more like a vessel carrying precious cargo. Lately, the fog in my mind had thickened. I started losing time. I would be working on a design layout in the morning, and the next thing I knew, the sun was setting, and I was sitting in the garden with no memory of lunch or the afternoon. When I panicked, Julian would smooth my hair and speak in his soothing, practiced baritone. He assured me these memory lapses were merely temporary side effects of the treatment, a small price to pay for pain management. He suggested I stay home more, that the stimulation of the city was too aggressive for my sensitive neural pathways. One afternoon, while passing his study, I heard him on the phone. His voice lacked its usual warmth. It was cold, clinical, detached. "The host is stable," he said. "There are no signs of rejection yet." I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Before I could process the strange terminology, he laughed softly and changed the subject. I convinced myself he was discussing a patient, a lab rat, anything but me. The unease deepened when Victoria gifted me a heavy, vintage silver hairpin for my birthday. It was beautiful, but felt archaic against my modern style. While sliding it into my hair, I felt a tiny hard lump on the ornate head of the pin. Curious, I pried the backing open with a nail file and found a blinking microchip. When I confronted her, Victoria didn't even blink. She claimed it was a high-end GPS tracker, necessary to protect the wife of a prominent surgeon from potential kidnappers targeting our wealth. Her explanation was smooth, but her eyes remained cold. Sleep offered no escape. I began having vivid, repetitive dreams featuring strings of endless numbers and the face of my father. He was a brilliant cryptographer who had vanished without a trace 15 years ago. In the dreams, he looked desperate, mouthing codes I couldn't decipher. Then the pain changed. The dull throb transformed into a sharp, buzzing sensation, like a live wire running just beneath my scalp. When I begged Julian to let me see a specialist at the city hospital for a second opinion, he refused outright. He became agitated, insisting that their equipment was primitive compared to the technology he had installed in our home basement. He claimed only he knew the intricacies of my condition. Suspicion is a slow poison, but once it enters the bloodstream, it spreads fast. While Julian was in the shower, I unlocked his tablet. His calendar was filled with medical seminars out of town. I cross-referenced the dates and locations. There were no medical conferences. Instead, the locations matched the offices of a law firm specializing in unclaimed estates and inheritance disputes. Julian wasn't learning how to save lives. He was meeting with lawyers to discuss assets that shouldn't concern a man whose wife was alive and well. For the first time, I looked at the needle he prepared for me not as a cure, but as a leash. I waited until the sleek black sedan carrying Julian disappeared down the winding driveway before I made my move. He had kissed my forehead with that practiced tenderness, telling me not to wait up because the legal consultations, which he still insisted were medical seminars, would run late. As soon as the gate clicked shut, I told our housekeeper I was heading to a day spa in the city to ease my migraines. It was the kind of frivolous excuse that went unquestioned in our circle. I dressed in nondescript clothes, pulled a baseball cap low over my eyes, and called a cab from a burner phone I had bought 2 days prior. My destination was not a spa, but a small, unassuming brick building on the outskirts of Seattle. The decision to come here had been sparked by a fragmented memory of a letter my father wrote shortly before he vanished 15 years ago. His handwriting had been jagged, urgent. He had written that if I ever felt my mind was being invaded, I should seek those who look into the truth without using knives. It took me weeks to decipher his meaning, but eventually, logic led me to the eyes. The eyes are the only part of the brain exposed to the outside world, the only entry point that does not require a scalpel to see what lies beneath. Dr. Adrian Silva was nothing like the polished, sterile colleagues Julian invited to dinner parties. He was disheveled, with wild gray hair and an office that smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic. I checked in under the name Jane Doe and paid the $300 fee in crisp $20 bills to ensure no paper trail would lead back to the Sterling Thorne accounts. Silva was brusque and efficient, treating me with a professional detachment that I found comforting. He ran through the standard vision tests, flipping lenses and asking me to read charts, and everything seemed mundane until he moved to the optical coherence tomography machine. He instructed me to place my chin on the rest and stare at the green crosshair. I held my breath as the laser scanned the back of my eye. The machine hummed, a low, rhythmic sound that usually signaled the end of the exam. But Dr. Silva did not tell me to sit back. Instead, he went rigid. The air in the small room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He leaned closer to the monitor, his breath hitching in his throat. Without a word, he reached over and killed the overhead lights, plunging us into near darkness. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice stripped of its earlier casualness. He rolled a different, bulkier device over to me. It was a high-frequency ultrasound scanner, something rarely used in a standard checkup. I felt a cold gel on my eyelid, and then the pressure of the probe. The silence stretched for what felt like an hour, broken only by the rapid clicking of his mouse. When he finally pulled away, his face was the color of ash. He swiveled his chair to face me, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped them on his lab coat. "This isn't normal," he whispered. The fear in his eyes was raw and infectious. "I cannot believe it. You have been walking around with this inside you all this time." He turned the monitor so I could see. On the screen, amidst the gray and black topography of my anatomy, there was something that did not belong. It was not a tumor or a blood clot, latched onto the back of my optic nerve, deep within the orbital cavity, was a geometric shape with sharp, artificial angles. It pulsed with a faint, ghostly blue light. "That is not a medical implant," Silva said. his voice low and urgent. "I served in the Navy as a medic. I have seen prototypes of this in classified briefings. It is called a neural lock. It is a military-grade bio-encryption device used to store high-value data inside a living host." The room spun. The migraine that had been lurking behind my eyes roared to life. But this time, I knew it wasn't a symptom of illness. It was the hum of a machine. Julian had not been treating me. He had not been saving me. He had hollowed me out and turned me into a human hard drive. The man I loved had not married a wife. He had acquired a storage unit. The horror of Dr. Silva's revelations settled over me like a shroud. He pointed a trembling finger at the glowing spot on the screen, explaining that the neural lock was currently in an active state. This meant it was preparing to either transmit or release its payload. He warned me that without the proper protocols, this process would fry my neural pathways, resulting in immediate brain death. I felt bile rise in my throat as memories of Julian's tender ministrations flooded back. The late-night checkups, the way he would place cold electrodes on my temples and hum while adjusting the frequency on his custom machines. He wasn't healing me. He was charging a battery. He was running diagnostics on hardware that just happened to be embedded in his wife's skull. I was not a partner. I was a petri dish. Dr. Silva's voice cut through my panic. He explained the cruelty of the design. The device was grafted directly onto the optic nerve, dangerously close to the frontal lobe. If anyone attempted to remove it without the correct decryption key, it had a fail-safe mechanism. It would self-destruct, taking the front of my brain with it. I would be lobotomized instantly. I started to hyperventilate, the walls of the small office closing in. Silva grabbed my shoulders, his grip firm. He administered a shot of a neural depressant. Explaining it would slow my brainwaves just enough to trick the device into thinking I was in deep REM sleep, buying me precious hours of lucidity without triggering the failsafe. The cab ride back to the villa was a blur of terror. I walked through the front door, my legs feeling like lead, and forced a smile as I greeted the housekeeper. The house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum. When Julian returned that evening, smelling of expensive cologne and lies, I had to play the role of the doting, fragile wife. I let him kiss me, repulsed by the touch of his lips, seeing him now not as a husband but as a butcher in a bespoke suit. Victoria was there too, sipping tea, her eyes tracking my movements with that predatory gleam. They were monsters disguised as aristocrats. That night, I lay in bed, listening to Julian's steady breathing, waiting for the rhythm of deep sleep. Once he was under, I slipped out of the sheets, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I crept down the hallway to his study. The forbidden zone he claimed was full of sensitive patient data. The door was secured with a biometric scanner. A week ago, this would have been an impenetrable barrier, but desperation had sharpened my mind. I remembered how Julian, in moments of arrogance, would use my own limp hand to unlock my phone while I was drugged with his serum. I had prepared for this. Earlier, I had carefully lifted a clear fingerprint from a whiskey tumbler he had left on the coaster, transferring it onto a piece of high-grade adhesive tape. I pressed the tape to the scanner. For a second, nothing happened, and I thought I was done for. Then, the light turned green, and the lock clicked open. Inside, the room was cold and smelled of old paper. I bypassed the computer and went straight for the physical files in his safe, which I knew he kept unlocked when he was home. A fatal arrogance. I found a thick dossier labeled Project Legacy. My hands shook as I opened it. The first thing I saw was an X-ray of my own skull, dated 5 years ago, months before I had even met Julian in that coffee shop. The file detailed everything. Julian had been stalking me on Victoria's orders long before our chance meeting. Our courtship, the romance, the proposal, it was all theater. They had identified me as the carrier of something valuable, something my father had left behind. The dossier outlined the final phase of their plan. Once the data on the chip had matured, a term they used as if I were a ripening fruit, Julian was scheduled to perform an emergency surgery to remove a ruptured aneurysm. The reality was far grimmer. The procedure was a cover for an extraction that would end with my death on the operating table, a tragic accident to the public, a successful harvest for the thorns. I stood there in the dark, the file heavy in my hands, realizing that the man sleeping upstairs had been planning my murder since the day he said hello. I dug deeper into the leather-bound journal tucked inside the safe. The handwriting was Julian's, jagged and hurried, lacking the elegant loops he used for prescription pads. On page 42, I saw my father's name, Leonard Sterling, circled in red ink next to a phrase that made my blood run cold. The God key. The entry described an algorithm worth billions of dollars, a master code capable of unlocking every major banking system on the planet. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father had not abandoned me 15 years ago as the police had claimed. He had been hunted. The Thorne family, led by the voracious Victoria, had chased him to the edge of the world for that code. I turned the page and found a detailed diagram of a cranial insertion. The notes explained that before his death, my father had made a desperate choice. He had biologically encrypted the algorithm and hidden it in the only sanctuary he had left the mind of his teenage daughter. He believed he was saving me, turning me into a living vault that no one would suspect. But he had underestimated Victoria Thorne. She had not just been his business rival. She was a predator who had spent decades sniffing out his trail, eventually leading her son to me not for love, but for corporate espionage. Reading on, the cruelty of their scheme became unbearable. Julian's clinical tone shifted into personal disdain. I read an entry dated 2 months ago where he wrote that I was too naive, a perfect but utterly hollow vessel. He described his exhaustion at playing the role of the devoted husband, calling it a tedious performance for an audience of one. He wrote that he was bored of the domestic charade. My heart shattered, not from the danger, but from the humiliation. I looked down at the wastebasket near the desk. There, crumpled among coffee grounds and apple cores, were the love letters I had written him for our anniversary last week. He had not even read them. He had torn them apart and used the back of the paper to test the flow of his fountain pen ink. I needed to hear it to believe it. I accessed a hidden audio file on his desktop named Progress Report 7. Julian's voice filled the room, but it lacked the warmth I knew. He was speaking to his mother. He sounded bored, irritated. He told her that he wanted to wrap this up soon because he was sick of babysitting this dairy cow. He actually called me a dairy cow, a beast to be milked and discarded once it ran dry. The medical logs were the final piece of the puzzle. The weekly serum he injected into my arm was not pain relief. It was a chemical cocktail designed to suppress my long-term memory and, more horrifyingly, to soften the cerebral tissue around the optic nerve. He was marinating my brain to make the extraction of the chip easier, ensuring that when he finally cut me open, my flesh would yield without resistance. Then I found the document that sealed my fate. It was a last will and testament, dated 3 years ago, bearing a forgery of my signature so perfect it made me dizzy. In it, I supposedly agreed that in the event of a sudden medical tragedy, my body would be donated immediately to the Ethelgard Institute for Scientific Study. They had legally paved the road to my murder, ensuring no autopsy would ever reveal the missing chip or the damaged brain tissue. I stood in the center of that cold room, surrounded by the evidence of my own dehumanization. The trembling in my hands stopped. The tears that had blurred my vision dried up, replaced by a clarity I had not felt in years. The fear that had paralyzed me since the clinic evaporated, burned away by a white-hot fury. I was not a patient. I was not a wife. I was a vault holding the most dangerous weapon in the modern world, and if they wanted to open me up, I would make sure the explosion destroyed them both. The time for fear was over. Now, it was time for them to pay. I huddled in the back of my walk-in closet, the only place where the thick layers of wool and cashmere dampened sound, and dialed Dr. Silva on a disposable phone. We spoke in rapid, hushed tones. He had brought in a man named Marcus, a white hat hacker and an old confidant of my father, who claimed he could build a remote signal cloner. This device would trick the chip into offloading its secrets wirelessly, saving me from the lethal surgery. However, for the clone to work, we needed the master decryption key, which was locked behind the firewalls of the Ethelgard Institute. The only back door was through Julian's private server in our basement. To buy myself the freedom to operate, I began a psychological game of cat and mouse. I stopped reporting the true nature of my pain. When Julian asked about the migraines, I lied. I told him I felt a numbness in my toes or a phantom ringing in my left ear, symptoms that completely contradicted the clinical progression of the device. It worked better than I expected. I watched his brow furrow as he frantically checked his tablet, doubting his own calibration data. His arrogance was his blind spot, and by feeding him false data, I made him sloppy and distracted. I needed a concrete window of time to access his office, so I insisted on hosting a small dinner party. I invited 2 couples from the neighborhood to serve as unwitting witnesses to my well-being. Julian hated these events, but he played the part of the gracious host. I took charge of the drinks, and into his 3rd glass of heavy Cabernet, I dissolved a crushed sedative I had saved from an old prescription. It was not enough to harm him, but just enough to ensure that once his head hit the pillow, he would not wake up for hours. By midnight, the guests were gone, and Julian was out cold in the master bedroom, his breathing deep and rhythmic. I slipped out of bed and crept down to the basement server room. It was a cold, humming fortress of blinking lights. I located the main port and inserted the drive Marcus had prepared. The upload bar on the screen moved agonizingly slow. Suddenly, the sound of the front door unlocking echoed through the silent house. I froze. I heard the distinct click of heels on the foyer marble. It was Victoria. She must have returned for something. I was trapped in the hallway between the basement and the living room. Panic surged, but I forced it down. I remembered Julian mentioning that sleepwalking was a potential side effect of his serum. I let my eyes go unfocused, my jaw slack, and I began to drift aimlessly into the living room just as Victoria entered. She had come back for a forgotten clutch purse. When she saw me, I did not react. I stared right through her, swaying slightly. She scoffed, muttering something about my pathetic state, grabbed her bag, and left without a second glance. I returned to the server room, my legs shaking. The software Marcus wrote was doing its job, but it was also pulling up files I had not expected. A window popped up showing live feeds from hidden cameras. I saw our bedroom, the bathroom, even the shower. Julian had not just been monitoring my vitals. He had been watching me with a voyeuristic, clinical obsession. The violation made my skin crawl. Then I found the calendar entry that stopped my breath. It was marked for 3 days from now, on our 5th wedding anniversary. The entry was titled Harvest Protocol. The notes were meticulous and chilling. Julian planned to stage a domestic accident, specifically a fall down the grand staircase, which would cause enough trauma to justify emergency surgery at his institute. That was his endgame. He was going to push me down the stairs to kill me. I did not just steal the decryption key. I copied everything. I downloaded terabytes of incriminating data, including the complex money laundering schemes funneling through shell companies, the records of illegal human experiments on the homeless, and the detailed premeditated plan for my own murder. I held the drive in my hand, feeling its cold weight. It was no longer just a tool for my survival. It was the weapon that would bring their entire empire crashing down. I knew I could not wait 3 days. The anniversary was tomorrow, and the air in the house felt thick with impending violence. I packed a small bag with essentials and moved toward the front door, but as I reached for the handle, a red light pulsed overhead. The electronic lock clicked shut with a finality that echoed in my bones. The smart home system announced in a pleasant, robotic voice that lockdown mode was engaged. I turned around to find Julian standing at the top of the stairs. He was not the groggy man I had drugged hours ago. He was wide awake, and the mask of the loving husband had completely slipped. He looked at my bag, then at my face, and sighed with the disappointment of a scientist whose lab rat had tried to bite him. "You figured it out, didn't you?" he asked, descending the stairs slowly. His voice was devoid of affection, replaced by a chilling pragmatism. He didn't even bother to deny it. Instead, he lectured me. He told me I should feel honored. He said my life was a small, insignificant price to pay for the greatness of the Thorn legacy, that my brain was merely a container for something far more important than my soul. Before I could run, the front door opened from the outside. Victoria swept in, flanked by two burly men in dark suits. She held a vial of clear liquid. Without a word, she instructed the men to hold me down. She brought the vial to my lips, explaining it was a muscle relaxant to make my transport to the Institute easier. I struggled, but their grip was iron. As the glass touched my lips, I made a desperate gamble. I let the liquid enter my mouth but held it in my cheek. Then, I convulsed into a coughing fit, spitting the bulk of the drug into a handkerchief I had clenched in my fist. I let my body go limp, feigning unconsciousness. They dragged me to a waiting SUV. I lay across the back seat, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, my heart pounding so hard I feared they would see it through my chest. Julian sat in the front passenger seat, muttering about the change in schedule. As the car sped down the winding forest road, I slowly reached into my hair. I pulled out a long, sharp steel hairpin, not the tracking device Victoria had given me, but a weapon of my own. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward and jammed the pin deep into the driver's neck. He screamed, jerking the wheel violently to the right. The SUV skidded on the wet asphalt, spinning out of control before crashing into the muddy embankment. The impact threw everyone forward. While they were disoriented, I kicked the door open and scrambled out into the pouring rain. I didn't look back. I ran blindly into the dense forest, the branches whipping my face. Behind me, I heard Julian shouting orders. I glanced back and saw the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness. Julian was leading the chase, a tranquilizer gun in his hand, his face twisted in a rictus of rage. My foot caught on a protruding root, and I went down hard, a sharp pain shooting through my ankle. I couldn't outrun them like this. I saw an old drainage pipe half buried in the earth, smelling of rot and decay. I dragged myself inside, pulling dead leaves over the opening. I pressed my hand over my mouth, holding my breath until my lungs burned. I heard their heavy boots squelch in the mud just inches above my head. Julian stopped directly over me. "I know you are here. Elena," he screamed, his voice cracking. "There is nowhere to go." I waited until their footsteps faded into the distance before I crawled out, limping and covered in filth. I made my way to the main highway. A long-haul trucker saw me waving frantically and pulled over. He didn't ask questions, just let me climb into the warm cab. As we drove away, I borrowed his phone and dialed Dr. Silva's number with trembling fingers. I told him I was out, and I was coming to the rendezvous point. The game was no longer about escape. It was about war. Dr. Silva's clinic was no longer just a medical facility. It was a bunker. I sat inside a small, windowless room that he had hastily lined with heavy copper mesh, creating a makeshift Faraday cage. This was the only place on Earth where the GPS signal from the device in my head could not reach the satellites Julian controlled. It felt like I was underwater, cut off from the world, but for the first time in days, the buzzing in my skull seemed to quiet down, shielded from the constant pinging of the network. Marcus, the hacker my father had trusted, arrived with a face full of grim news. He hooked his laptop up to the portable scanner Silva had set up. He explained that the chip was entering its terminal phase. It was starting to heat up physically. I could feel it, a dull, radiating warmth behind my eyes that made my vision swim. Marcus told me that if we did not extract the data and cool the system down within 24 hours, the thermal runaway would cook the surrounding tissue, causing permanent brain damage or worse. But Marcus had found something else, a feature even Julian likely didn't know was active. The neural lock functioned like the black box on an airplane. It was a two-way recording device, for 5 years. While it sat dormant in my head, waiting for the algorithm to mature, it had been passively recording audio from my environment. Every conversation, every threat, every cold-blooded confession Julian and Victoria had made while they thought I was asleep or sedated was stored right there in my temporal lobe. I wasn't just carrying the algorithm. I was carrying the smoking gun that would send them to prison for life. My fear hardened into a cold, jagged resolve. I told Silva that survival was no longer enough. I wanted to dismantle the Ethelgard Institute brick by brick. I used a secure line to contact FBI agent Miller, the man who had investigated my father's disappearance years ago. He was hesitant at first, but when I sent him a sample of the encrypted financial records showing the Thorne family's money laundering operations, his tone changed. He agreed to look into it, but he warned me that my situation was precarious. He was right. An hour later, my face was plastered across every news channel in the country. Julian had gone on the offensive. He had reported to the police that I had suffered a severe psychotic break due to schizophrenia and had kidnapped a nurse before fleeing. It was a lie, but it was a powerful one. I was now a fugitive, armed and dangerous in the eyes of the law. I knew I had to fight the narrative before he buried me under it. I set up an anonymous account on a social media platform and started a live stream. I kept my face in the shadows, my voice distorted. I didn't rant. I simply played a 30-second audio clip from the chip Julian's voice, clear and arrogant, talking about harvesting me. I told the world that I was not sick. I was a victim of human experimentation. The stream went viral instantly, sowing enough doubt to prevent the police from shooting me on sight. Julian responded with a press conference. He stood at a podium, looking like a broken man. He wiped away fake tears, begging me to come home so he could treat me. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes pleading, but I saw the shark beneath the surface. He painted me as a threat to society, a ticking time bomb that needed to be defused. I realized he would never stop hunting me as long as he thought he could win. I had to lure him out of his fortress. I had to make him believe he had the upper hand. I decided to use the one thing he wanted more than my death, the God key. I sent an encrypted message to his personal server. I told him I was tired of running. I offered a trade. I would give him the decryption key for the algorithm if he let me walk away. I set the meeting place at the abandoned hydroelectric power plant where my father had worked decades ago. It was a ghost of a building, rusting and hollow, the perfect place for the past to finally kill the future. The abandoned hydroelectric plant was a cathedral of rust and decaying concrete, its hollowed-out shell amplifying the sound of the wind howling through the broken windows. I stood on a high metal catwalk, gripping the freezing railing to steady my trembling legs. Below me, the heavy steel doors groaned open, and beams of tactical flashlights cut through the gloom. Julian walked in first, flanked by Victoria and a squad of 6 private mercenaries heavily armed with assault rifles. They looked less like a rescue party and more like a death squad. I stepped into the light, making sure they saw me. From this distance, I must have looked small and defeated, a fragile woman at the end of her rope. I called out to Julian, my voice echoing off the damp walls. I pointed to the dusty, ancient security cameras mounted on the pillars surrounding us. I demanded he tell the truth, to confess what he had done to me and my family, so the witnesses watching the feed could hear it. Julian did not flinch. He simply looked up at me with a smile that chilled my blood. He raised a suppressed pistol and fired 3 times in rapid succession. Metal crunched and glass shattered as the cameras exploded one by one. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He told me there was no one here to save me. He said I was nothing but a container, and that containers which had expired were simply discarded trash. Victoria stepped forward, her face twisted with impatience. She barked orders at the mercenaries, telling them to secure the asset immediately. She shouted that she had a mobile surgical unit prepped in the truck outside and she wanted the chip cut out before midnight. She did not care if I survived the procedure, she only cared about the data. I reached into my pocket and pressed the trigger on the device Marcus had built. It was a localized frequency jammer. Instantly, the mercenaries' earpieces screeched with high-pitched static. Their tactical lights flickered and died, and the night vision goggles they wore became blindingly white. Confusion erupted below, while they clawed at their ears, cursing. I turned and sprinted deeper into the factory, heading toward the old reactor chamber. I heard Julian screaming my name, his footsteps pounding on the metal stairs behind me. I had separated him from his pack. I led him into the labyrinth of pipes and turbines, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and grease. I reached a dead end near the decommissioned turbine, a sheer drop to the dark water below on one side and a wall of concrete on the other. Julian lunged at me from the shadows. He slammed me against the wall, his hands closing around my throat. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wide with a maniacal desperation. He screamed at me to speak, to use my voice to unlock the encryption. He needed the password, which was my own voice spoken in a specific cadence. I gasped for air, clawing at his wrists, and asked him why he hated my father so much. Julian leaned in, his grip tightening. He sneered that he did not hate my father. He simply found him inconvenient. He confessed that he had been the one to ensure my father died 15 years ago. He had not just watched him die. He had intercepted his heart medication deliveries, replacing them with placebos, watching from the shadows as the man gasped for his final breaths. The rage gave me a burst of strength, and I kicked him hard in the shin, but he barely flinched. He backhanded me across the face, sending me crumbling to the cold grate floor. My vision blurred. Julian knelt over me and pulled a surgical scalpel from his jacket pocket. The blade glinted in the dim light. He was done playing games. He muttered that he did not need the operating theater anymore. He would just cut the forehead open right here and rip the prize out himself. I watched the blade descend, bracing for the agony. Just as the cold steel touched the skin of my forehead, a piercing, resonant sound erupted from inside my own skull. It was not a noise I heard with my ears. It was a vibration that shook my very teeth. Doctor, Silva, and Marcus had triggered the remote resonance frequency. The chip in my head emitted a sonic pulse so powerful it acted like a shock wave. Julian screamed, dropping the knife and clutching his head as the sound disoriented him, bringing him to his knees in agony, while Julian clawed at his temples, screaming as the sonic resonance shattered his equilibrium. I saw my opening. I did not hesitate. I kicked the surgical scalpel from his loosening grip, watching it skitter across the metal grating and vanish into the dark water below. I turned and sprinted toward the emergency exit Marcus had highlighted on the blueprints, my lungs burning with every step. I was 10 feet from the heavy iron door when Victoria stepped out from behind a rusted generator. She was no longer the poised matriarch of high society. Her hair was wild, her expensive coat smeared with grease, and in her manicured hand she held a small silver pistol leveled at my chest. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, avaricious hatred. She shrieked that she would take my head whether I was alive or dead, her finger tightening on the trigger. I froze, trapped between a madwoman and a monster. Then the world turned white. A beam of light so intense it felt physical cut through the shattered skylights of the factory, pinning Victoria to the floor. The thunderous roar of rotor blades drowned out her scream. A voice boomed from the sky, amplified by a loudspeaker, identifying themselves as federal agents and ordering everyone to drop their weapons. Victoria looked up, blinded and confused. She did not understand how they had found us. She did not know that the ancient security cameras I had pointed to earlier were just a distraction. The real eyes were the 3 micro cameras sewn into the buttons of my jacket, broadcasting a live, high-definition feed directly to the FBI command van parked 2 miles away. Agent Miller had seen everything. He had heard the confession, the threat, and the order to kill. Victoria, driven by a lifetime of unchecked greed, made a fatal error. She swung her gun toward me in a final act of spite. A sharp crack echoed through the cavernous hall, but her bullet pinged harmlessly off the metal railing above my head. A split second later, a single shot rang out from the catwalk above where the SWAT team had breached. Victoria jerked back as a bullet struck her shoulder, spinning her around before she collapsed to the concrete, the gun clattering from her hand. I looked back to see Julian trying to scramble to his feet. He was disoriented, bleeding from his nose, but his instinct for self-preservation was intact. He lunged toward the shadows, trying to slip away into the maze of pipes. I was closer. I stepped forward and hooked my foot around his ankle. He went down hard, his face slamming into the cold iron floor. Before he could rise, 2 agents in tactical gear were on top of him, zip-tying his hands behind his back. The adrenaline that had fueled my flight suddenly evaporated, leaving only the searing pain in my head. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor. Through the haze, I saw Dr. Silva and a team of paramedics rushing toward me. Silva was shouting orders, checking my pupils, his face pale with worry. As the agents hauled Julian to his feet, he thrashed against his restraints. He looked at me, his eyes wild and desperate. He screamed that I could not live without him. He yelled that he was the only one who knew the extraction protocol and that without his hands, the chip would detonate and kill me. I looked up at him from the stretcher, feeling a strange, cold pity. I told him he was wrong. My father had not created the lock to imprison me or to serve as a vault for their greed. He had created it to protect me from men exactly like Julian. The paramedics lifted me onto the hoist of the medical helicopter. As we rose into the stormy night sky, I looked down one last time. I saw the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers surrounding the factory. I saw Victoria being loaded into an ambulance in handcuffs, and Julian being shoved into the back of a black federal vehicle. They looked small from up here. They looked like nothing more than common criminals. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the helicopter carry me away from the hell they had built for me. The surgery did not take place in a cold, hidden basement, but in the sterile, sunlit operating theater of a top-tier military hospital, under the watchful eyes of federal agents and Dr. Silva. Julian had screamed that I would die without him, that the procedure was too complex for anyone else. He was wrong. He had viewed the device as a machine to be hacked, but my father had designed it as a part of me. We did not need scalpels or bone saws to remove the clamps. I simply had to speak, under local anesthesia. I recited the passphrase my father had embedded in my subconscious so many years ago. As the final syllable left my lips, I felt a strange, delicate release inside my skull, like a fist unclench after holding on for too long. The bio-anchors retracted, and the chip slid out, guided gently by Dr. Silva's steady hand. The chip contained the God key, the algorithm that had cost my father his life and stolen 5 years of mine. I handed it over to the government officials waiting outside the door. My terms were non-negotiable. In exchange for the drive, I demanded full immunity, lifetime protection, and the immediate, verified destruction of the algorithm. I would not let the weapon that destroyed my family be used to destroy the world. They agreed. The trial was the spectacle of the decade. The defense lawyers tried to paint Julian and Victoria as misunderstood geniuses, but the evidence I carried in my own head was irrefutable. The audio recordings from the chip and the live stream from the factory were played in open court. The jury heard every threat, every cold calculation, and the confession regarding my father's murder. Julian Thorne was stripped of his medical license permanently. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in federal prison for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and grievous bodily harm. The brilliance he prided himself on became his undoing. Reports from the penitentiary say he has completely unraveled, spending his days muttering to the walls, conducting imaginary surgeries on the air. A broken man trapped in the prison of his own mind. Victoria Thorne fared no better. Her empire was dismantled piece by piece. The court seized every cent of the Thorne family fortune to pay for damages and legal fees. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for orchestrating multiple economic crimes and the hit on my father. The Ethelgard Institute was raided, investigated, and permanently shuttered. A significant portion of the seized assets was awarded to me as restitution. I did not keep the blood money for myself. Instead, I used the millions to establish the Sterling Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal and medical aid to victims of medical abuse and psychological manipulation. It was the legacy my father would have wanted. My recovery was miraculous. Without the constant radiation and pressure from the neural lock, the migraines vanished completely. My memory returned in vibrant technicolor, no longer suppressed by Julian's drugs. I was finally, truly whole. On a crisp autumn morning, I visited the cemetery where my father was buried. The air was cool and smelled of fallen leaves. I stood before his headstone, tracing the letters of his name. I took the diamond wedding band from my pocket, the symbol of the 5 years I spent as a prisoner in plain sight. I placed it on the dirt over my father's grave, leaving the lie where the truth lay sleeping. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a decade, the wind against my skin felt real. There was no hum in my ears, no foreign object pressing against my brain, no one watching my every move. I was free. I turned away from the grave and saw Dr. Silva and Marcus waiting for me by the wrought iron gates, smiling. I walked toward them, not as a victim or a survivor, but as the architect of my own life. The nightmare was over, and the day was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Elena's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to us.